talking with Jon McCray. We are going to talk about various atheist cliches that we hear all the time, and we're basically tired of it.
Let me start
Oh.
that.
Okay, cool. So we're going to see how many of these we can get through because there are tons of them. Let's just get on with it. Let's get straight into it. So thanks for doing this with me, Jon. It's great to chat. Okay, so the first one we've got is hear this all the time. Atheism is just a lack of belief in mythical deities. What do you make of that?
Yeah. So my thoughts on this
Can you hear me okay? Have I cut out again?
So first off, the classical kind of philosophical definition of atheism is to believe.
Thoughts on this?
What's that?
So first off, the classical kind of philosophical definition of atheism is to believe.
Okay.
Yep.
Have I cut out again?
Okay, now you're back.
Yep.
So whenever I hear this claim that atheism is just a lack of belief, first off, the classic kind of philosophical definition of atheism is the belief that the proposition that no gods exist is a true proposition. So when people try to say that atheism is just a lack of belief, a lot of the time what they mean is they're trying to remove the burden of proof from atheism. So conveniently, you'll kind of hear this claim go along with things like, I'm not the one making any claims, you are, so it's your job to prove to me that God exists, and it's not my duty to put forth the proposition that atheism is true. And so this is kind of a little clever thing that's really popular online. It's not really popular in academia, but it's popular online. And what I would kind of say to that is, if that's the definition that you want to accept, that's fine with me, because, I think that's just kind of one of those claims that just say, like, you can be mentally incompetent and be an atheist. You can be dumb and be an atheist. You can be in a coma and be an atheist. You can be brain dead and be an atheist. So if you're trying to tell me that atheism is the superior position to take, and it's a position that that a person can adopt no matter how dumb or brain dead they are, then that's fine with me. Then I'll go ahead and accept that. But don't go around telling me that atheism is superior to theism, which actually requires even a minimal amount of thought to be a theist. You know what I mean? You have to believe that God exists, so you have to think a little bit to be a theist, and a little bit more to be a Christian. But on that definition of atheism, you can just be as dumb as a box of rocks, and you can still be an atheist. So in my mind, if that's what you want to accept, then that's what you can accept, and I'll be happy to concede that definition. Just don't tell me that atheism is superior to Christianity.
Right. Yeah. And I kind of think I kind of this is a bit of a bugbear for me, because I feel like when atheists take this kind of lack of belief, they kind of say atheism and agnosticism are kind of interchangeable. It makes the word kind of, it's got less meaning. Whereas if atheism is either I believe God does not exist, or I think I know, I'm convinced, I'm certain that God does not exist, then it makes more sense as a thing to say I'm an atheist means I'm in this camp. Whereas if you say I'm an atheist, and it could mean all that, but it could also mean you're as dumb as a bag of rocks, then it's like,
yeah,
it's the umbrella that is too wide. It's a meaningless word, and then you have to ask another question to say, what kind of atheist are you? Whereas, like, if you I just want them to say I'm an atheist, that means I'm in the camp that believes God is not a real big thing, rather than I'm sitting on the fence either way. Okay, so yeah, cool. Right. So I'll move on to the next one then, because it's kind of similar, which is there's a more kind of broad thing, is that when they say I don't have any beliefs.
Yeah. What gets me about, like, I don't have any beliefs, like, what sounds particularly noble about that? I don't know if, like, it's trying to say that, like, you're humble, or if it's just an alignment, kind of like how the first one we just said, that kind of thing. But everybody has beliefs. I mean, and everybody has some sort of opinion about God to some degree. You can be an agnostic in the sense where you say, I don't have enough data to draw a conclusion, but that's still some form of belief. You still believe that. So to say that you have no beliefs is just nonsensical. That's impossible, unless, again, you're brain dead, which is all you really need to be an atheist anyway, I guess, according to the first definition. So.
So I'm not sure if the time lag is. So yeah, okay. So yeah, I'll move on to the third one then, which is very similar again. Is I don't have any faith.
Okay, yeah. So if someone says they have no faith, then immediately my first thought is to say, what do you mean by faith? Because there's kind of this kind of popular definition of faith that's not really consistent with the biblical definition of faith. And so it depends on both parties what they mean when they use the word faith. So if some Christians might mean by faith, they might mean just the absence of any kind of evidence or reason or anything else. Some Christians may mean that, but that's not consistent with the biblical definition of faith. But for the most part, what Christians mean when they say that they have faith in God, at least an informed Christian, is that's thinking along the lines of what the biblical definition of faith is that that it's trust in something that you have good reason or evidence to believe. It's not a blind faith or a leap in the dark. So in this sense, if we adopt the biblical definition of the word faith, and then the atheist is speaking in that context, then we would say that the atheist very much does utilize faith, because the atheist believes several things on faith. He trusts the words of what scientists say. He trusts that he was born in whatever state his parents said that he was born in. He looks, when he's driving down the road, he has faith that the street's not going to open up and swallow his car in, or that the building that he's in isn't going to collapse. These are things that he doesn't have direct access to, but he still believes based off of evidence and based off of his experience. And so in that sense, the Christian is going to say the exact same thing. So if the atheist says that he doesn't have faith in the sense that he thinks that Christians mean when they say that they have faith, then we might have some common ground there. But I think ultimately we're operating off just the same definition of the. If we are operating off the same definition of the word, then we probably have some agreement.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So I think when they're saying that, they're always talking about like blind faith. They're saying that they don't have blind faith because they think that's the only kind of faith. But then, as you say, that's not the biblical definition. As Martin Luther King said, faith is about taking the first step on a ladder that you can't see the top of. It's like you've got some steps, there's some steps, there's a ladder, you just don't know, there's a top, you just don't know what's in the middle. That's kind of what it's about, really. And yeah, as you say, they have the same thing with various things. And the good example, like John Lennox gave in the debate with Richard Dawkins, is when he said, "Do you have faith in your wife?"
Yeah, I actually really like the way you put it too about the latter. It is like that kind of like it's not contrary to reason. So we believe in God and we can reason our way to God. But even if just say we don't know everything about God, we can't see God in His complete fullness while we're on Earth. That doesn't mean that we're operating off of no evidence whatsoever. And it's the same thing. I like how Lennox talks about, or how Lennox said that too. It's like, do you have faith in your wife? I mean, yeah, you don't have any hardcore empirical data that can predict your wife's next actions with 100% certainty, but based off of what you do know and based off of the data that you do have and based off of knowing her personally, you can say that you trust and have faith in your wife, that she's not going to go out and rob a grocery store and murder people, right? And it's similar to like that when we're talking about faith, because we do learn a lot of things about God, and we have good reasons to accept those things that we believe about God, which we'll probably have to get into at a later point. But just nonetheless, that's what, for the atheists that are watching, that's what we mean when we talk about faith.
I just remembered another really good quote from Oh, I can't remember. It was Saiten Brugengate, if that's how you say his name. I can't remember who he was debating, but it was amazing. This guy said this. He said, "I don't have any faith," and then Saiten he said, "Oh, so what about you don't have faith in science?" No, faith in science. So what kind of other word would you say? Do you have confidence in science? Yes, I have confidence in science. Oh, confidence, as in confide, the Latin for with faith.
Yeah, yeah. That's funny. I never heard Sai make that argument, but yeah, that's funny. That was actually pretty funny.
It was brilliant. It
That's
was
funny. That's funny.
it was one of those kind of mic drop moments. It was great. Okay, so yeah, the next one is kind of ties into what you was just saying as well. So the number 4 is there is no evidence for the existence of God.
The way I'd kind of would proceed if this is, I mean, when you say that, I don't know what people are asking for, right? And so it's like, there's no evidence that I'm here right now talking to you guys, or this bookshelf is behind me. There's no evidence for it. If I said that to you, what would be your initial response? Your initial response is going to be like, well, of course there's evidence. Here's the evidence. And then what if I just said, well, that's not evidence, because this is how conversations go a lot of the times with atheists who are just hyper skeptical. And I think there's a sense of being a healthy skeptic. I'm skeptical about a lot of things. I don't necessarily come to conclusions that easy. And when I do come to conclusions, I'm always trying to challenge my conclusions a lot of the time. So there is a degree of healthy skepticism. So that way it words out your false beliefs, so that way you can hold on to true beliefs. But there comes a problem when skepticism is used to ward out true beliefs that you don't like, and then what makes you hold on to false beliefs. Now that's where skepticism becomes a problem, right? So whenever somebody tells me that there's no evidence for God, then I just will ask them, well, what evidence have you looked for? Because that's what typically the question is. So if I tell you that there's no evidence for I don't know, for this water bottle or something like that, right? What would classify as evidence would be that you can see this water bottle here, so you have sensory evidence right here, right? So you can see the water bottle. So in this sense, if I say there's no water bottles in all of London, all you have to do is go look to where you believe a water bottle will be, and you can go to the grocery store and you see a water bottle, and then you can confirm that, oh, okay, you know what I mean? There's water bottles. So anyways, I'm making this way more complicated than it needs to be, but the basic idea is first you want to ask what they were looking for when they said that there's no evidence for God. So 9 out of 10 times, what they're probably looking for is some sort of scientific proof or some sort of empirical data that you can see. They looked on top of a mountain and didn't see God on the top throwing lightning bolts, right? That's what they mean when they say there's no evidence for God, right? So, but obviously that's not the kind of God that we believe in, and that's not the kind of God that the great monotheistic religions believe in. You know, the great monotheistic religions believe in a God who is spirit. The Bible says that God is spirit, right? And so because of that, we're not going to be able to detect him with our physical eyes. Now, this is not a problem because if you really kind of think about it, even when you look at a crime in the past, they don't have, you can't see the crime in the past. You can't go back into the past and see. So when you're looking at evidence that's being used in a courtroom, they go off of eyewitness testimony. They go off of like the psychology of the people who say that they witnessed it. They go off of, all kinds of data that's non-empirical, right? And so it's the same kind of thing when we're talking about God. If we can look at these different things in the world, right? And we can say, what would the world look like if God did not exist? What would the world look like if God did exist? Which is something that a lot of atheists try to say. Richard Dawkins says the world looks exactly the way it would look if God did not exist. But I don't know what kind of definition he's using for God, but that's the kind of way that we can start at least. So we can say, like, if the universe had an absolute beginning, right? And everything that begins to exist does have a cause, then we can reason that there's a cause that created the universe that's outside of time, space, and matter, is eternal, and has volition. Now, I know I have to argue for the point to say that he has free will, which can do that another time, or I can do it if you want me to. But the whole kind of point is that this is reason, this is evidence. So we're taking the evidence that we can see, and then we're coming to the logical conclusion. And we do the same thing when we're talking about quantum mechanics, or we're talking about the Big Bang Theory and all these things. You make predictions. You say, if the Big Bang Theory did happen, these are some things that we'd be able to test. So we form a hypothesis. And that's exactly what we did, because we were able to confirm this with the cosmic background radiation and the redshift and all these other things. So in other words, we have evidence that the universe is expanding and stuff like this, but it's not that we actually saw the Big Bang happen. It's not that we can actually directly perceive the Big Bang happening, but we base it off of the logical conclusions of what we'd expect if the Big Bang did happen. And it's the same kind of thing we do when we're talking about God. We're looking at all of these different things, and we say, if God does exist, we would expect that the universe had a beginning. You know what I mean? And we would expect that the fine-tuning makes sense if God exists, and the existence of objective morality makes sense if there's a God, and so on. So those are kind of things that we can look for as evidence for God. And we can also look to personal experience that religious people have to some degree too, at least having some sort of out-of-body experience or something like that. If we are souls and there's consciousness is immaterial, then at least that's a little bit more evidence that the world has things that are immaterial, and that's more consistent with a view that has God in it instead of a view that doesn't.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah. So basically, the response to that is have a ton of evidence. But one of the things I think about when they say this is kind of, it's almost like it's a claim in itself. Evidence for God does not exist. Whereas if they're being more honest and accurate, then what they should say is, I am not aware of any evidence. I don't know. I haven't seen any. Because to say that there is none is too much. Like, if we go back a couple of 100 years, someone could say there is no evidence for radio waves, and they didn't know anything about radio waves, so that's true. They didn't have any evidence for radio waves, but there was still radio waves, microwave, all this stuff floating around. They just didn't know about it. So just the very fact that they had no evidence in their possession doesn't mean that these things didn't exist. It was just a case of, I am not aware of it, but then not being aware of the evidence doesn't mean the thing isn't really there.
Right, exactly. I completely agree. And also the other thing is, you could even say that it's not good evidence. That would be more reasonable than saying that there's no evidence, right? Because if I present evidence for you to, and it's just bad evidence for some case or something, it doesn't mean that it's not evidence. It's just not good evidence, or not compelling evidence, or not evidence that's enough to, just like in court, beyond the reasonable doubt, or whatever kind of criteria you want to use. The only thing is that you need to use a criteria that is consistent with the other things you believe. You can't cherry pick and give a higher set of standards for God than you would give anything else that you can't prove empirically. Right,
yeah. So evidence is kind of like, every piece of evidence is an arrow pointing to a conclusion. But like in a courtroom, you might have 10 pieces of evidence pointing to this guy did it, but then there's one other piece that means you have to throw his case out because he definitely wasn't there or something. So that those 10 things are evidence. It's just they kind of lead to the wrong conclusion. But you can't say that they're not there. And until there is that one other thing, which in the case of God there isn't that one other thing. So and it doesn't look like there ever will be. But still. Yeah, it's no evidence is not the same as bad evidence, like you're saying, yeah. Okay, so we'll move on to the next one, because I think it's kind of related again. I don't know if I've done this on purpose, putting them in like an order that they kind of connect to each other. I think it's just a complete coincidence. But okay, so number 5 is this phrase I've heard a few times. Atheism is the null hypothesis.
And yeah, for that I would just go back to pretty much what we've kind of already established. I mean, I guess if I had more time, I would try to explain the like probability and stuff like this. That and Jon McCray does some stuff on this too. But there's no such thing as a neutral position in that sense that you don't have to argue for. And even if and what I say on a practical level with agnosticism, at least you're saying, I don't know, and I don't have enough evidence to make the conclusion. But when you say that atheism is essentially identical to agnosticism, yeah, I would call that cheating.
Yeah, yeah, totally agree. Yeah, so I think it could come down to like what we were talking about before about the definition of atheism, where we tend to take atheism as they're in the camp of God does not exist, whereas they might be taking it as agnostic. I don't know. So to say the camp that God does not exist is the null hypothesis, I think that's wrong. To say being agnostic, that's maybe okay, because that's like we just don't know. But if atheism, as we would define it, versus theism, they're two competing claims. So not having evidence for one or something doesn't make the other one automatically right. I think it just puts you back in the middle of that's agnosticism. But I think there are a lot of these guys who want to take it to God does not exist rather than, yeah, like you say, it's cheating.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I had a long discussion a while back with Kel Nearing, who's a guy that argues online, really bright guy. But we discussed this in depth with probability theory over the span of a couple days, and I think I kind of made my point in that discussion. Maybe I can dig that up or something like that, and if so, then I can put it on here or however you want to do it, or But yeah. But anyways, I would agree with you. So
Cool. Okay. Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah, I'll be interested in seeing that. So yeah, we should do that. So. All right, so we'll move on to the next one then, so we don't get too bogged down with the heavy stuff there. Well, this one might be kind of. So number 6 is philosophy is not supported by science.
yeah, I guess my first question would be why would it have to be supported by science? Because I don't really understand what they're kind of getting at. If they mean that we don't need philosophy to do science, then I would just disagree. I mean, philosophy is thinking correctly and thinking along the lines of logic and everything, and also making like conceptual distinctions so that way we can know what we're talking about. So when somebody talks about an atom, it's not this broad word that can mean anything. I mean, that's doing philosophy. So to engage in critical thinking, you have to do philosophy. So a lot of people, I think, like when Stephen Hawking's and who was it, like Lawrence Krauss and them, I guess, were there was a few people that were talking bad about philosophy. Oh, Bill Nye is just like, that was probably one of the like most objectively stupid talks that I've ever seen in my life, when he was on Big Think talking about philosophy and he thinks that it's like pondering a rock or something. It was ridiculous. I remember but anyways, he clearly had no idea what he was talking about. So this is again why it's so important to ask people what they mean, because 9 out of 10 times they probably have no idea what they're talking about. And so
Right.
yeah, I guess if you want to see the most objectively stupid critique of philosophy you've ever seen in your life, look at Bill Nye's view or talk on Big Think. But I did hear that recently Lawrence Krauss has changed his position on philosophy and now sees that it has value. I haven't checked to see if that's true or not, so look it up. But from what I've heard, that's what's, at least he's probably got corrected on understanding what philosophy is, and now he can understand the value of philosophy.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, that's good to hear. It's nice when they change their mind on something. But yeah, like philosophy is like, it comes first. It's almost like the relationship of physics to chemistry, isn't it? You can't have chemistry without physics. It's like so yeah. So science doesn't need to support philosophy because philosophy is the more basic foundational thing that science is on top of. Like, and it's kind of, by saying that, it's self-contradictory. Like, philosophy is not supported by science. As you say, critical thinking is philosophy. So saying that, you're almost making a philosophical claim, aren't you?
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, cool. So, all right, the next one is, I suppose this one is one we could probably talk about for hours. So we'll have to do it kind of briefly, really. Try and knock it down to a couple of minutes, which I think we can do. But number 7 is the story of Jesus is based on earlier myths.
Oh yeah, no, this one is really deep. This one's true. I'm just kidding. Like most cliche atheist claims, this one's another stupid claim. And the reason why is it's not because it just sounds so far-fetched. I mean, it sounds plausible if you know nothing about, pagan myths. And then what's unfortunate is right now we're in a time of, we're in an information age where there's just so much information out there, and people lack a lot of times the ability or the desire to sift the good information from the bad information. So when we hear these kind of cliche slogans like Christianity was copied from pagan myths, and there was all these resurrection stories and all this other stuff, that's going to disturb you at first. I mean, if you're a sincere seeking Christian, I mean, first time I kind of heard this after I converted to Christianity, I was like, oh no, I mean, is this true? And if it is true, then I'm going to have to reevaluate my beliefs, right? But then when you actually read any of the stories, you just see how stupid these claims are. And that's just one of those things is like, if there was, there really should be some sort of kind of thing online where whenever you pull up an article, it has like a stupidity meter where you can say this article is just beyond stupid and false and fallacious, right? That would be nice, but that's not going to happen, because then people would have to stop, or then people would be thinking even less. And I think the thing that we want people to do is to think more and to actually look at your claims before you start throwing them out all over the place. And that's one of those claims, right? And be willing to be corrected. I mean, that's the worst part to me, is that a lot of these people that make this claim, when you just line up the stories, it's just ridiculous to say that Christianity was copied from pagan myths. But instead of people admitting that, you know what I mean, a lot of the times people will just kind of hold to their guns about it, and it's just absurd. They try to look for any possible parallel between those stories and Christianity. So, for example, like, oh, these stories say that there's life after death, and guess what? Christianity does too. Like, that's supposed to be impressive, right? And that's the kind of stuff that you get. So what I found helpful in life is to really figure out the reason why people are saying what they're saying, because a lot of times these things are just smoke screens for something else. Like, so try to ask questions to get to the core issue of why they really reject Christianity, because it's not as simple as just saying I reject Christianity for intellectual reasons. I mean, we're not just purely intellectual and rational beings, and you see this in economic theory. The classical kind of economic theory was that human beings are perfectly rational and will make rational decisions. Now, we know that's just not true. It doesn't happen that way. People make economic decisions with their money for purely emotional reasons, mostly emotional reasons, you know what I mean, in a lot of cases. So I think this is where people just overly simplify, like, how these objections to say, oh, this is just shutting down Christianity. Because I guarantee you, if you ask the person, you say, if I can prove to you that Christianity is not copied from pagan myths, would you then become a Christian? Right? And I'll guarantee you, even if they say yes, they're not going to, because that's not what the core issue is, right? A lot of the times the core issue is more of these kind of social issues where they have friends that are homosexual, or they might be homosexual or something, and they feel like Christians have been mean to homosexuals. And now Christians shouldn't be mean to homosexuals. That goes against biblical teachings and everything else. But the bottom line is that if that's the real issue, that's the kind of issue we need to deal with, because to say that Christianity is copied from pagan myths is just factually false, and it can be easily demonstrated. So if anybody wants more information on that, I have a video of Mary Jo Sharp on it on my channel. So just type in Mary Jo Sharp and it'll probably come up on YouTube. And it's called Was Christianity Copied from Pagan Myths? And then you can get a little bit more of the information there.
Oh, great. Yeah. I'm a fan of hers as well. I agree 100%. I've heard that. Yeah, I've heard this claim a few times. The first time I heard it, it just completely bounced off of me, because it was a friend of mine recommended that movie Zeitgeist to me, saying, "Oh, you'd love this. You've got to check this out. It's all about politics and that." I'm like, "Oh, okay, yeah, I'll check that out." And then, but the first half of it was about religion, and the first thing they open, I don't know if you've seen it, but the first thing they open is like Jesus was copied from Osiris and Dionysus and da 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 da. And as soon as they said he's copied from Dionysus, I was like, Dionysus never did anything like anything. Jesus, what are you talking about? This is all nonsense. Just because I kind of I grew up learning the Greek myths, and it was a big passion of mine. I was like, like there's no comparison between these two guys. What are you talking about? And so all you have to do is have a basic knowledge of any of these figures, and it's like no.
Yeah, and you've got additional problems. It's not just that there's no parallels. It's like this isn't even a Jewish idea. I mean, on top of it too, like once you understand the kind of historical context, you understand why the evidence for the resurrection is significant. If you can't understand the historical context, a lot of these things might not just sound significant, you know. But this is not even a Jewish idea, and you really think that these die-hard monotheistic Jews are going to be like, oh, we've been hearing these Greek stories all the time, so now that you just put Jesus' name on them, even though he didn't exist, because that's what they usually will say, all of a sudden we're all going to abandon our strict faith and deem ourselves to hell, or potentially deem ourselves to hell just because of this, you know. And that's where it's just like, it's hard, because for people to understand stuff like this, they have to kind of learn a little bit, and a lot of the time, like, you know, people don't really want to spend the time to learn, you know. So that's why I think the best way to handle stuff is to just kind of ask people questions. Like, I would ask them, be like, oh yeah, what stories did he copy from, and what's the original story say? You know what I mean? Because after you do that, they're not going to know what to say, because they didn't read the original stories, and then they just heard it from somebody else, and then you can ask like why they believe that this person's right. You know what I mean? So you just ask questions. You probably walk them through it, and then they can kind of come to the conclusion themselves that they've been duped.
So exactly, yeah, that's a good way of doing it. Just say, yeah, can you show me these stories? And you're either going to find that there is no original document that says anything like what they're saying, or you're going to find that the document was written long after Jesus. So if anyone was doing any copying, it was the pagans.
Right. Yeah. And that's the thing too, is I have a sibling who doesn't believe in God, and it's against Christianity. And he'd say to me, he goes, yeah, well, he'd always say this. I mean, that Christianity is copied from pagan myths. And so I was like, okay. I was like, man, that's going to be really tough for my faith. Read one of the stories and then show me, and then tell me the parallels, so that way we can talk about the story. But read the full story, because I'm just kind of curious how the full story goes. You know what I mean? And then once he does that, you know, he's just like, you know, he doesn't have anything to say. You know what I mean? He can try to kind of go back on those kind of cliches, but then you just ask him, did you even read the story? Because what happens next? What happens next? You know what I mean? And you know, it just kind of exposes it to himself, you know, so.
That's it. Okay, I think we've done that one, so I'll move on to the next, which again is one that probably could take up a whole couple of hours, but we'll see how we do with it in 5 minutes or whatever. So number 8 is the Gospels were not written until several decades after the supposed events.
Yeah. So this is one of those things that that's where knowing history becomes really important. So if you hear this and you're like, oh man, like if you think about it today, right? So imagine you something miraculous happens at the White House or something, and then it's not written about for 50 years or something like that, or 20 years, or I mean, really, it's not you know that bad. But if you say like, say 20 years, right? You're like, oh man, it's not written about for 20 years. Can I even trust this? In reality, you still could trust it, right? But people be skeptical because we think of modern day reporting to be like this, but that's not how ancient history works. They were in oral society where things were transmitted orally, because this is how, because I mean, a lot of the culture was illiterate too. Like they didn't even have quotation device back in this time, right? So, and plus it was expensive to write things down, and a lot of people couldn't read anyway. So actually how they would learn and stuff like this in school is people would be trained in memorization too. So they would remember stuff, and there was people that were what's the word I'm looking for? They were traveling. I'm going to just say people. Traveling people who would do these things for a living, and disciples' job was required to remember stuff. Yeah, there you go. And you know, disciples for all kinds of disciples, their job is to remember this stuff and all too. So does that mean that everything they reported is true? No, that's not. But that's not to say that the mechanism of oral tradition for a while is not true. But here's where things get more interesting, is because even with the span that we have, that is written in the same decade and during the lifetime of the people that witnessed the event, that's significant because a lot of the times that's not, or most of the time, that's not the case in ancient history, right? So you have like even Buddha. I can't remember how long they said after the Buddha people started to write down about what he said or whatever, and it was over 600 years or something like that. But even like Alexander the Great was like 500 years. But you have all these people that we or all these kind of things that we know these stories are true, and we trust them historically because we understand the transmission of how things were done at that time. But the problem is that when it comes to the Bible, people are way more hesitant, right? And people are just way more skeptical, and they're like, oh no. But like, if you're going to accept the existence of someone like Alexander the Great, then it would just be completely hypocritical to reject the existence of Jesus, because the evidence for Jesus is way stronger. We have more biographies and of Jesus than we do like any other figure in ancient history, right? And so there's all these kind of things, but it's kind of hard to just like lay it all out all at once. If I had to recommend some books on it, I would say this Mike Licona's book, The Resurrection of Jesus, is really good. It covers all of the evidence, not all of the evidence, but a big chunk of the evidence, and it gives you both perspectives on it, on both sides of it. So he tries to be as objective as possible when he goes through it. So I think that's good for the skeptic to start off with. You also have like what is it? Craig Blomberg's. It's somewhere up here, but anyways, Craig Blomberg's books are always really good on it. Yeah. Here it is, The Historical Reliability of the Gospels. I mean, these are some places to start, I think, for like if somebody's sincerely trying to be an honest seeker and kind of really looking for evidence for Jesus and the resurrection. I mean, start there so that way you can kind of get the historical context, understand why things are significant. And what to me is really compelling is that we know what the first Christians believed. We know that they believed that Jesus died and resurrected. Yeah, I mean, we know that this is what they believed to experience. Like, we know that, right? And so it's one thing to say like, who knows what happened, and this because of oral transmission. I mean, even if that was the case, we know that this is what they believed, the early church and the early disciples and everything else. So if we're looking at it from a historical aspect to try to make a historical case for the resurrection, at least that is something that we know that we can affirm, that they sincerely believed it and believed it to the point that they were willing to die. You know what I mean? And this is obviously different from terrorists today, right? Because the terrorists today would be in the same kind of position that we're in. They would have heard these stories and then they believed them and then they were willing to die for them, right? But this isn't the case for the earliest disciples. They were in a position to know if Christ really did resurrect or not because he was actually there in front of them, right? And so that's why, like in I think it's 2 Peter, where he says, we didn't follow cleverly devised myths. This is something that we witnessed with our eyes and heard with our ears, And so that's why I think it's just so sick. I mean, it's just amazing, and we know something happened. That's why N.T. Wright's book is really cool for this, because it's like something incredible happened at this time that changed the entire landscape of how thought was going at this time. Like, people believed they had these experiences with the risen Christ, and it changed everything. And in given to know like how these monotheistic Jews were, this would be the furthest thing from plausible to happen. You know what I mean? Because it sounds like they're worshiping, for them it's just like God is just one person. But then to believe that Jesus is God, we know that they believe this, and to believe that Jesus is God is just super dramatic. Like, even though they were struggling for the language to try to explain it too, when you look at the Greek and stuff like this. So anyways, it's all super interesting stuff, and we could talk about it for a long time, but that's just kind of just a couple of kind of brief thoughts about it.
Yeah, I mean, I personally am convinced that pretty much all of the New Testament was written pre-70, possible exception of Revelation. But like, as you say, like the manuscript evidence says the whole, like, it's going to be no later than 100 AD. So I mean, that's only adding a couple of decades to that. And because of everything you've just said is like, well, there's doesn't really make us any less likely to trust it than if it was like as early as I think it is.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
So number 9, this is a particular another bugbear of mine, which I've done a video on. I think you might have done one already, actually, but let's go. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it depends. Like, I guess the kind of problems with it. The basic problem is that it's just not true, right? If you look at like even using probability theory, that's just not true. What you want to see is if the amount of evidence that's available makes this claim more plausible than its negation, right? But just on a kind of practical level, when you say extraordinary evidence, what you're talking about is some sort of subjective state. Like you're telling me, or it's a psychologically dependent state. Right. Like what counts as extraordinary can differ from every single person. So you're not really establishing something that's objective that we can look at when we're trying to get to a conclusion, right? So for me, the fact that we're in a time where people can make these water bottles could be extraordinary, right? I mean, if we took this back freaking 1,000 years, that would be extraordinary, right? And then, so really it's just so subjective where it's not really saying much. And I think a lot of atheist claims kind of boil down to this a lot of the time where it's like, if I'm not convinced, or if you don't convince me and change my psychology, then the evidence is not good. Then therefore the objective evidence is not good because my subjective psychology has not changed. And to me, that's like, you don't come to believe or disbelief for purely just like these rational reasons, right? All the time, or purely intellectual reasons, rather. There's emotional factors that are involved that you may or may not even be conscious of, right? So like if you're raised by like some really weirdo, creepy religious people who use religion as a weapon to abuse you and stuff like this, the evidence for God's existence after you've walked away from God is you're going to be looking at it through a little bit of a different lens because you have emotion involved that needs to be overcome, right? So working through these kind of emotional issues is going to be part of the healing and part of you being able to accept it, right? Because people don't just accept things based off of intellectual reasons. Like I've resolved people that I know, like all of their objections to Christianity, like you know what I mean? But then at the end, it's still lingering, right? Because that's not actually what the core issue is. So anyways, I guess I say that trying to set up a criteria for objective evidence to be dependent on your psychology is not necessarily, such an arbitrary aspect of your psychology too. That's kind of the main problem. Is it's an arbitrary thing. It's like it can just change from person to person, and it depends on what the person chooses to be extraordinary that's going to count. So
right, yeah, and I've got my problem with the first extraordinary is that exactly as I say, it's completely subjective, and my problem with the second extraordinary is what does it even mean? Like, what does it even mean? It's like any evidence is going to be what you see, what you've experienced, what you've tested, and like if God appeared to you in front of you in a blaze of glory, it would be your eyes. But that's not extraordinary. Seeing is not an extraordinary thing. It's just the same evidence as you have for anything else. So I don't know what extraordinary evidence is supposed to be.
I agree.
Okay, so I'll leave that because that one does bother me a lot.
The thing that's kind of unfortunate about these objections is like, sometimes like it's just like, man, like there's just a lot of I guess like education to be kind of be given, and that's not a bad thing. I mean, a lot of times, like if I don't know something well or whatever, I mean, I could be completely ignorant about it, and then sometimes I could be arrogant in my ignorance. I'm assuming if I think I know something and I don't know, and I think nobody's really exempt from this, right? And so like what gets me the most is when atheists say these things so confidently that are so silly and such bad objections because they haven't thought about them, but they think that like that claim or something just completely destructs Christianity, or they can find some like new view on physics that's completely fringe and has no evidence, and they think like it has enough force to just destroy any argument, right? And to me, I'm like, you confuse saying something or hearing something with demolishing an argument, and this happens all the time. Like they think if they can say anything, the argument just has no value at all, and it's just destroyed. And to me, that's just like, it's just so naive, and it's just kind of a kind of childish way of thinking, because a lot of times your objection can be really stupid, and so you haven't really destroyed anything. You've just patted yourself on the back for not even doing anything, or feeling like you did.
Yeah, it's just that whole thing of like, if you've got the last word in an argument, that means you win. It doesn't matter what the content of the discussion was. You had the last word. Okay, so number 10 is a good one, good round number. Actually, I think we've kind of done this, actually. Faith, by definition, is not based on evidence.
So we kind of already covered that.
Yeah, we kind of already tackled that one, yeah. It's another one.
Yeah, so I'll do number 11 instead, because we've done that. We did number 10. That's kind of rephrasing an earlier one. But number 11 is you can't prove a negative.
And what if I say yes, you can? And that's the whole thing. Is like then I want to hear an argument. Like, why do you say that, right? And then it's just not true. I mean, so so. Reason it's not true is because we prove negatives all the time. So if I say that there is an elephant that's, or so you're saying, let me try to think. If you say, so to give context, why they say this is because some people say atheism kind of requires a burden, right? You have to say God does not exist and therefore it's a burden. And then a lot of the times they're going to say something like, well, you can't prove negative. So you can't say something does not exist and then show that. But that's just not true. Like, this is exactly actually what people do when they try to say that the existence of evil proves that God does not exist. If it was impossible to prove a negative, you could not use that argument, because that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to say that attributes of God are contradictory, so therefore he cannot exist. So it's like saying a square circle. If you can, you're saying a square has 4 sides, a circle has no sides, so you can't have a square circle because that thing cannot exist, because the attributes that they both have to obtain contradict each other. And so people are trying to say the same thing when they say that the existence of evil and God are completely incompatible. Now, I don't think they are, and we can talk about that another time, but that's pretty much like, just shows you just like how either unthoughtful or uncharitable people can be with some of their arguments. And I mean, that's not to say that this is just atheists that do this. I mean, Christians do this too. It's like if you haven't thought it through. But I mean, think it through, right? This is gonna be your go-to slogan. Like, really, just like think it through, you know. So,
yeah.
But anyways, it's like I can prove that Santa Claus doesn't exist at the North Pole, because if we go to the North Pole, there's there's not a factory where people are creating toys, and there's these little people that are, creating toys, and then you don't see Santa flying around on, and delivering presents into chimneys, right? Because if Santa did exist, then we would be able to see him coming down people's chimneys and putting the gifts underneath the tree. But the fact that we can test that, we can prove that Santa does not exist. You know what I mean? So that's just kind of it in a nutshell, I'd say.
Yeah, so that's the fact that we can show that. Yeah, it just disproves it. I think you covered the 2 ways of doing it. Is like the square circle. You show something's a logical impossibility, so some contradictory properties, then it doesn't exist. And then the other thing is, if there's like an idea of something, then you go to where there should be evidence for it. And if there's no evidence where there definitely should be some, then there's reason to think it doesn't exist. Like Santa. I just looked at the next one on the list. Is number 12 is philosophy is dead. Well, I think we covered that as well. So I guess that's probably, we're about halfway through the list. So I guess that's like a good place to wrap it up, and hopefully we'll be able to finish it off another time if that's cool.
Yeah, no, absolutely, man. Like anytime, yeah. Because I didn't even really see the list, but I'm more than happy to go through the rest of the list next time. So. Yeah, man, thanks for having me on, and we'll come back to do the part 2 we'll set something up.
Oh, nice. Yeah, thanks for taking time out to talk to me as well. It's been really great.
Yeah, no problem, man. And thanks for having me on, man. Anytime. And I just pray that you continue forth, and pray all goes well for your ministry, man. So I'm proud of you, and just keep it going.